So now you've seen a little bit of the basics of creating UI elements and then modifying their properties in order to see things on your UI. So that's a pretty simple concept, pretty basic concept where you can say create a button and assign its properties and assign its content property be equal to click me, and then maybe do a little bit of basic messing around with some of the background colors. Now let's say I wanted to do something a little bit more interesting and maybe start to deal with collections, or how would we deal with collections of items within XAML. Now, one of the ways that I started to allude to previously was, let's say I was working with a button and I wanted to do something like this. I wanted to have its content be equal to click me, and then I wanted to set its margin equal to 100. So now we have a nice little button there, and now I wanted to set the background color of that button to maybe something other than black. So we saw an instance of where I could just set the background to a solid color brush and have it be blue or green. But let's say we did want to actually use a gradient, say a linear gradient, to actually specify some color within this background of this button. So the way that we'll do that is by using our property element syntax, where I'm going to say, all right, button.background. We're going to specify that this is going to be using a linear gradient brush, but the problem here is that this takes a collection. And so how do we handle a collection? So as you can see here, I can work with a collection of gradient stops. So the way that we're going to handle that is by using the linear gradient brush, and we're going to specify that it has gradient stops. And now this is a collection. This is going to be a collection of gradient stops. And now I can add in any number of gradient stop objects in here that I would like. So I could say gradient stop, and then I could set the offset equal to 0, and then maybe set its color equal to red. So there's one stop. Now, this doesn't look like anything quite different than what we did before with a solid color brush. But if I were to come in here now and add another gradient stop, because remember this is just a collection, so I'm adding in different instances of this gradient stop class or gradient stop objects into my gradient stop collection, and we'll say at 1.0 we're going to set this color equal to green. So now as you can see here, we have a linear gradient starting from red at offset 0 and then transitioning to green at offset 1. So now we've worked with a collection here within XAML. So what would something like that look like in C#? Well, it's very similar to creating any sort of list. So we could create some sort of list and say it's a new list of gradient stop objects. And then we can instantiate a number of them and add them to the list, where we can say new gradient stop. And then we would do something like setting its properties to say offset is equal to 0.0 and color is equal to red. Now that's not going to be necessarily valid syntax, but you would get the picture of what something like this would look like if we were doing it in C#. We could set the other one here to 1 and then the color equal to green. And then ultimately, if we were to set this collection of gradients to the background linear gradient brush of this button, we would ultimately get the same thing. So as you can see here, we can do a number of things. We can set very basic properties within our XAML elements using our property element syntax, but we can also set more complex properties that say take in collections of items or lists of items simply by adding a series of UI elements or property elements to those collections, and then they show up quite nicely on your UI.